All right, everybody. So we have Brad Dieter with us today. How you doing, Brad?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. And Brad has a master's in biomechanics, a PhD in exercise physiology, and he is co-owner of Eat to Perform. And today you picked the Ronald McDonald House for your charity, right?
Yes, I did.
Can you go a little bit into why?
Yeah, it's they have a local Ronald McDonald House, and we try to every year go serve a few meals there for the kids, and it's always just such a cool experience to see, you know, a resource for families with long hospital stays. A place where families can stay that's not in the hospital. That kind of gives them a little piece of home while they're away. A lot of times people have to go to hospitals from a long way away, especially this part of the country, and they don't get to go home. So it's really nice to see families have some of the comforts of home during a lot of these really trying times in young kids' lives.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, that's a great cause, and happy to make my donation to them today. So thanks for bringing that one to my attention.
Yeah.
And I like to start off with some important questions. So, being in this industry, how often do you get a comment about your last name seeming like dieter?
Every interview, so that's for sure.
I didn't want
Um,
to, mess it up.
and then a lot. It's always one of those things. Everybody thinks it's a pseudonym, and especially in social media, they think I made it
Yeah.
up. But no, it's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies, I guess.
Right, right. So I had heard another interview you had done. I forget exactly where, but you had mentioned some of the effects of carbohydrates on the microbiome. And I've heard a number of people say how when they have too many carbs, they seem to get a lot of GI distress. And now carbs in general are a little bit more voluminous of a food than, say, fat. But why do you think that is? Are we seeing just changes in the bacteria that are causing people to have upset stomachs and things like that, or what's going on?
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes down to the context of those people. A lot of it depends on what types of carbohydrates they're eating. Are they very starchy? Are they super fibrous? Kind of what's their dieting history? Have they been eating a lot of very low carbohydrate foods for a long time and then reintroducing carbohydrates? We do know that that's pretty typical. In practice, people who restrict carbohydrates for a long period of time and then reintroduce, especially starchy carbohydrates,
Hmm.
they tend to have issues with digestion. People who have, just digestive issues in general, a lot of it just kind of depends on the context. So it's kind of one of those things of, the microbiome is so unknown for a lot of reasons. And sometimes it just comes down to what's the context and the situation of the the consumption of those carbohydrates.
Okay. And I did hear in one interview you mentioned how for optimal performance you pretty much need carbs, and you had said that you need full glycogen, which requires carbs. Now I'd actually read at least one, maybe two studies on people doing a long-term ketogenic diet, and I'm definitely not like a keto zealot or anything like that. I think it has some applications, but in this particular study, after they had adapted, they actually found that glycogen levels were identical between the ketogenic group and the higher carb group. I don't know if you've seen any data on that. And this was endurance athletes.
I don't know if I've seen that data. I can imagine that after a sufficient amount of time, kind of your basal levels of glycogen, especially if you're an athlete and you're consuming, an adequate amount of calories, that your
Mm-hmm.
glycogen storage, may return to pretty close to normal levels. But I would imagine that doesn't negate a lot of the performance aspects that come from that. We do know there's downregulation of certain enzymes that control glycolysis. We do know that during long races or long events that are, of sufficient demand, that you are going to require some level of exogenous carbohydrate to sustain that level of workload. So even if you just, in theory, can correct baseline levels of muscle glycogen, you're still going to have you know, some adaptations that are not going to be super positive when it comes to, sustaining high output for a long period of time.
Sure. Yeah, and I think long period of time is key there, because even when I had tried keto, I've done it a few times, just to kind of experiment, and I was actually able to still do my interval training, but my interval training was 10, 15-second sprints. So, the net time still isn't that great, even though we think of intervals as like you need a bunch of carbs and everything like that.
Yeah, 10 to 15 seconds really is mostly the phosphagen system. So even then, you're not going to be utilizing a lot of those carbohydrates for the actual work. Some of the recovery you will be, but predominantly you'll just be using the phosphocreatine system.
Right. And at least from what I've seen now, it seems like we kind of need to individualize our nutrient timing and things like that, in the sense that we have the data that shows averages, but of course people are going to respond to different ratios and total amounts. But you wrote a good article on nutrigenomics, and I think you use the term performigenomics.
Yeah.
So obviously there's been people who have tried to use this to market things and sell things. Could you explain why that's currently not super applicable to most people?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really basic idea of the fact that, your metabolism and your performance capacities are regulated by so many different genetic processes, right? Like if you think about, just carbohydrate metabolism and how many enzymes are involved, each of those has a genetic regulatory mechanism, that's both epigenetic, that comes down to the actual, genome code. So just something as simple as that's controlled by a lot of stuff. So very small changes in genetic code there is not going to make substantial differences in terms of, how your body processes food in general. And the same thing goes with performance, right? I mean, if you think about the average person, their phenotype is controlled by hundreds and thousands of different genetics, especially their performance-based ones. So, trying to figure out individual genes that regulate that kind of stuff is not going to be super helpful for most people.
Yeah. And I'm guessing you're familiar with 23andMe and Promethease.
Yeah, yep. I've read through a lot of their data in their databases and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I got Promethease done probably 3 or 4 years ago. And for people listening, 23andMe kind of they run the data, but you can run that raw data through Promethease, and they will tell you what each gene is supposed to encode for. And so the way I went about it, there's like 22,000 genes that they analyze. So something like 15,000 were what they called positive, and like 1,000 were negative, and then the rest neutral. So I thought, well, I'll go through the bad ones, and then I'll go through the good ones. And I can tell people do not do that, because even though it's a small percentage, going through 1,000 genes that are negative about you is not a good way to start your day. And so it would say, we look at these, like I said, phenotypes and things, and it would say I had like 10 genes for increased obesity, 15 for like higher heart attack rate, and all these things like that. But then when you go to the positive, there's another 15 that are like more likely to be lean and not have a heart attack and things like that. So most of these things have so many different genes involved that I think it's nearly impossible to just look at it and say, based on this, at least right now, based on this, you need to do this one diet or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's the real crux of the issue, right? Is let's just say you have a whole 300 genetic marker profile for your risk of developing obesity, right? There's nothing that I can think of amongst those 300 that's going to tell you exactly what the optimal, dietary pattern is for you to reduce that risk. It's still going to come down to most of the basic things that we know and understand about human physiology.
Sure. And probably my favorite article that you had linked me to was the one on longevity and calorie restriction. I think that's a really interesting topic. And your points were largely that it might not really do that for us. Like people, for years, they've studied different animal models, and they've shown that when they cut the calories by as much as half, I think there's something like a 30+% increase in lifespan in a lot of these animal models. But could you explain why that might not translate into humans or really at all there?
Yeah, there's just a lot of reasons. So probably one of the first ones is the animals that they study are just, their metabolisms are so much different than humans, right? The amount of fasting they do a lot of times equates to like weeks of humans not eating. Their lifespan is just so much different than ours that trying to extrapolate just doesn't work. A lot of it, like, think about the physics of an ant, right? Like, if we were to be scaled proportionally to an ant, our legs couldn't hold our body, right? Like
Right.
just things break down as animals scale and as metabolism scale and all sorts of stuff. So those ideas, don't always carry across species and especially across scales of species. The other point is that a lot of the theories of like longevity and aging that a lot of these calorie restriction models are based on haven't really been proven, right? So there's a lot of it comes down to like the metabolic rate or the metabolic theory of aging, right? Where the faster your metabolism runs, the faster you age. And that doesn't appear to hold true across all species. So like birds, that equation completely breaks down. So higher metabolism, sometimes those animals live longer than the ones with slower metabolism. So a lot of the underlying theories why calorie restriction and longevity are often talked about together don't hold true even across different levels of analysis and the different theories of why that is. And the other one that's the most important is there's no data in humans to suggest that's true. And even the primate models, they've kind of found that there's some really big limitations with those studies that kind of even call those into question. So there's just, you have to have a lot of evidence to suggest that that's true, and none of it's really added up to this point.
Did you see the more recent study with the two primate models where they had tested the different quality of foods and how that changed it? Do you know what I'm referring to?
I haven't seen that one. Mm-mm.
So there was one, I know Dr. Peter Attia had talked about, and he had basically gone over the results that when they had them eating ad libitum with, I think, like, high sugar, high fat foods, and then they did the calorie restriction did result in increased lifespan. But when they had them eat what I guess like healthier foods, I don't remember how they defined that, but I guess what we would typically describe as healthier foods for that species, there wasn't a benefit from the calorie restriction at all. And what he had at least said from that was that, yeah, if you're eating a bunch of crap and then you eat less of that crap, then, it will be beneficial. But if you're eating healthy foods, it might not really matter at all.
Yeah, and I think there's probably two pieces that would go into those results. One is in almost every scenario we know where you give, mammals access to, high energy dense foods, they tend to overeat. And then there's, a lot of poor health patterns that come with overeating. So then restricting and bringing you back to a baseline level of normal calorie intake and kind of addressing some of the chronic issues that come with excess energy intake obviously would correct itself, right? So there's that piece which seems fairly obvious. It's like if you make something bad and then you make it good, you're going to see a benefit. And then there's also probably the inherent piece of, more nutrient dense foods probably do give you some additional health capacity than, pretty nutrient poor foods.
Sure. And in general, longevity is a very interesting topic to me. So I know you looked a lot into it from a nutrition standpoint, but do you know, I guess, as far as scientists can tell for now, what their thoughts are, like the primary cause of aging at this point? Is it a free radical damage over time and the oxidative stress, or do we have a better answer now?
Gerontology and aging is not my primary field, so a lot of this stuff I'll say is, I'll couch it with I'm not an expert in that. I think
Sure.
From what I know is I think it's multifactorial. I think it's, I think a lot of it just comes down to entropy, right? Like as things increase in time and as systems get disordered, things start to break down. And I think that's true of, I think that's part of the free radical theory of aging, and there is some truth to that. In some people, the metabolic theory of aging does have some weight.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's things, like telomeres shortening, which is really a process of entropy. So I think a lot of it just comes down to just this general trend towards disordered or organized systems becoming disordered. And I think those are all features of that idea. And I think a lot of the anti-aging things we try to do or we're trying to study are, how do we control that entropy or kind of reverse it?
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of it is people want, as we kind of said before, one answer, like this is it and this is how we do it. And they'll take that to the extreme. And you see that with diet. You also see it with training. I think there was a study out by Harvard at least 10 years ago that showed that people who exercise more than 7 hours a week on average started showing an increased mortality rate. And so people think, I mean, maybe not as much of the people that we deal with, but a lot of people think a marathoner is going to be like the healthiest person or somebody who's just always exercising. But there definitely seems to be a cutoff where more is not better. And then that's when you start seeing AFib and a lot of these endurance athletes and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've learned that from pretty much every end of the extreme spectrum, right? The further you go in one direction, typically the further from optimal you become, right?
Right.
There's always like the trade-off of extreme phenotypes kind of bring you away from, what the optimal ability to handle every situation becomes.
Right. So, I mean, given what we know now, how are you using your data or your information to manipulate diet in athletes or weightlifters? I mean, since we can't base it just on genetics, how are you going about optimizing it for the people you work with?
A lot of it comes down to context, right? Like knowing where your clients are and what their needs are, right? So general weight loss population has a much different, need and optimization strategies than somebody who, is a high level endurance athlete, somebody who does ultra marathons versus somebody who, maybe there are an operator for the military and they're over in, extreme environments, high heat, high altitude, long periods without food. All of those are very different contexts. And what type of data you need is really different, right? So a general weight loss population, the type of data you need to look at is, okay, what increases adherence rates to dietary plans? What are optimal ways to increase caloric burn throughout the day? And, what's the type of training that's best geared towards aesthetic changes? Endurance athletes are, what types of foods and what types of nutrient mixes are best for long-term training, acute recovery, what type of supplementation do you need to prevent them from getting sick during cold climates? So you kind of just use the data for each situation. There's really no kind of like optimal way to approach the general answer of people.
Sure. Do you factor in much with timing? I mean, maybe for some like the super athletic people who are doing multiple events, but do you focus much on nutrient timing, or is it kind of just get your macros in by the end of the day, or even just get your calories and protein in and then fill in the rest? I know a lot of different coaches kind of there's a spectrum there.
Yeah, again, it depends on where your client's at, right? So I would say for the general population of people, it comes down to like, what's your calorie balance over a week? What's your calorie balance over a day? How much protein are you getting in a day? How are you balancing the rest of your calories? What is the quality of those calories? How is that changing your behaviors? And then you start talking about, okay, now here's some ways we can optimize the timing piece. So it's, in the general population, it's pretty far down the ladder. In athletes who have, high training volumes, multiple training sessions a day, then that starts to become higher up on the discussion. So we do some work with like college basketball players who have hour and a half long training sessions in the morning and then a 2-hour practice in the afternoon. So that's where, the timing piece is like probably the second thing we talk about after like, hey, you just got to get calories. And it's like, okay, now let's talk about you have to get food right after your morning session before practice. So it kind of, again, depends on who's the client, where are they, what are they doing?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm sure, like most of the people I've worked with have been general population lifters, but not like serious athletes. I'm sure you have a better background there than I do. And to me, I just don't notice a huge difference when, like I said, I mean, I went from higher carbs to keto, and even then, I just don't feel that different for the most part. But I think when you're working with top athletes, you do see that. And so I'm just wondering the level of detail when you're working with a top athlete. Do you really see like, okay, if we move 30 carbs from here to another time of the day, are you actually noticing measurable changes there, or is it kind of just maybe they believe it'll help, so it'll help kind of thing?
Yeah, you know what's funny is a lot of people have this idea that elite athletes are like dialed into everything.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time, those people are succeeding despite their nutritional
Right.
behaviors instead of due to, right? So a lot of those people, um, a lot of those really elite athletes, you know, it takes them a while before they get to that point. But once they kind of start to figure it out, those small changes can make a difference. You know, especially as athletes get a little bit older. You know, athletes in their early 20s who are high level elite athletes, you know, those small changes, they tend not to notice them as much.
Mm-hmm.
But as they get into their 30s and 40s, those things do start to add up, and they do start to notice those. At least that's from my experience, you know, just as a practitioner working with people.
Yeah, you definitely see the genetics. I mean, one of the, I don't know, best examples of like a freak at my college. He was like football star, was like inclining 315, like it was like a warm up. And I talked to him recently, and he had like dominoes all over his room, like just like stuffing himself with pizza. And he's an NPC competitor now. Like he just looks like a freak, but he doesn't work with a coach. He kind of just goes in there, lifts and eats whatever. And it's kind of amazing how some people, like you said, they don't really need to worry about those little things.
Yeah, it's the bell curve of humans is super interesting, especially when you see the people in the far end of that
Yeah.
bell curve.
Yeah, for sure. Are most of your population athletes, or is it kind of like people trying to get in shape, or do you just visit everybody?
So at each perform, a big portion of our clients is kind of general population people. Some of the private work that I do and kind of my private practice is with a lot of, I do have quite a few athletes, you know, kind of all over the spectrum, work with a lot of basketball players, work with a lot of people who work in kind of extreme environments. So yeah, I've kind of spent a lot of time with both, which is always really interesting just to see the juxtaposition
Sure.
of those two people.
Yeah. As far as manipulating the carbs there, we've said before, one of the reasons why, we talked about there were numerous reasons why a higher carbohydrate diet is superior to keto for athletic performance. How do you find that insulin plays into that as far as, being able to spike insulin during workouts, compared to not much of a spike relatively on keto? And not even just for performance, let's say for muscle growth.
Um, there doesn't really appear to be any substantial difference in terms of when we talk about manipulating insulin signaling for the average person.
Right.
I mean, one of the things we do know is insulin itself works more on, you know, reducing protein breakdown than it does augmenting protein synthesis. And in most people, their level of training and their level of hormonal optimization that they need doesn't really come down to things like, you know, the exact amount of carbohydrates or the timing of those carbohydrates for like an insulin spike.
Right.
Those type of people who benefit from that in any meaningful way are typically the people who are pretty high end on the spectrum of, bodybuilding, body composition. And typically those people are using other ways to manipulate hormones other than, trying to get the optimal post-workout insulin spike.
Right. Yeah, I had a friend who was type 1 diabetic, and we would always like mess with him because he would take insulin, but he actually later admitted that he was kind of like megadosing his insulin, which is obviously a dangerous move. But he wasn't, as far as we know, wasn't using any anabolics, and I don't know if there really would be that much of an anabolic response to somebody doing that without anabolics in the mixture. It's not something I've really ever looked into. I imagine he was probably doing more harm than good, but.
Yeah, type 1 diabetes is such a different scenario than pretty much anybody else. Just because there's such a fundamental difference of like having no insulin present versus even a small amount present and functioning.
Right.
I mean, the best contrast there is, people who have type 2 diabetes and have pretty severe insulin resistance, they still are very, very, very unlikely to get ketoacidotic, right? Because
Right.
even just that small level of insulin signaling kind of controls, the ketogenic process. Where somebody who's type 1, they are very aware that that can happen pretty quickly when insulin's not present at all.
Yeah. Have you experienced anybody going into ketoacidosis, type 1 or type 2, anything like that, athletes?
I haven't personally ran into it in any like live setting.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I think I cut out there. I was when I was working at a hospital, I had heard about a case and my ears just perked up because I had heard about it in this industry for so long, but I've never actually seen a case of it. But that's really the only time I've ever actually heard of it live. As far as protein, nowadays I think most people accept around 1 gram per pound. It's a lot more rare that people are doing 2 grams per pound or anything crazy like that. Do you bother manipulating protein for people depending on the time of the year or dieting, or do you just kind of keep it level and manipulate the other macros?
Yeah, it's the nice thing about protein is there is kind of like this window that you have that, seems to be optimal. That's pretty wide. I think the zero point 0.7 grams per pound to 1 gram per pound is kind of the window of, you're probably going to maximize most of your muscle protein synthesis and you're going to minimize any of the potential, lean mass loss from too little protein. And that's a pretty big window. I mean, if you take a 200-pound male, right, that's 140 grams a day to 200 grams a day, and you're in that window. And then from there, you can, there's periods where we'll increase dietary protein and there's periods where we'll decrease it, kind of depending on, what's their overall calories? Are they in kind of a weight loss cycle or are they in a weight gain cycle? What's their natural protein habits? So you kind of have a pretty wide window that you can manipulate it based on, time of year, what the goal is, what the context of that goal is, and you can operate pretty optimally in that window.
Yeah, I've seen some people speculate that once you're at a certain protein level, if you that's kind of where you need to be, especially when dieting, and that if you bring it lower, your body is adapted to that. I don't know your opinion on it. From my standpoint, if somebody's eating way excessive protein, I don't think bringing it lower to a more moderate level is going to be a problem. But I have heard people speculate that if, whatever you're having, you better not drop it because you're going to be in a negative protein balance there.
Yeah, I think that comes down to how long are you dropping it down for? Are they somebody who, if they lose, a half a pound of lean mass is not going to make a huge difference? So I think the fear of dropping protein down a little too low, I think people get a little bit too up in arms about. Especially if it's short term. I think it's pretty clear that long term, you kind of want to keep that in a pretty optimal window, especially over the long term. But there are periods where lower protein intake might make sense. If you've got an endurance athlete who needs, a lot of calories in a day, and they naturally tend to eat lower protein, and you want to operate at that lower end of the spectrum, for heavy volume trainings sessions, or periods of their season, for 12 weeks, you're probably going to be okay and not have a whole lot of negative effects on lean muscle mass.
When you say lower, you mean around the zero point 0.7 grams per pound range?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Cool, man. And I like to end on kind of an actionable step for people watching. So if somebody's kind of getting into this and maybe they've got their training down, but they're a little lost nutritionally, after they check out Eat to Perform, what would you say is their next step to try to get a solid base, on their nutrition?
Yeah. So after they sign up, the next step, I mean, there's kind of two things. One is, I think there's just kind of don't let the confusion stop you from doing anything, because kind of taking any action in that direction is better than not getting started at all. No matter what path you go down, you're probably going to start making some progress. Um, the best action item I would say for most people is, and this might sound crazy, but spend some time kind of tracking your food intake. For For the primary reason of it will acutely let you know what you're doing, right? You'll kind of have a good self-assessment. I think a lot of people they kind of start without really understanding where they currently are, right? It's kind of like if you're a trainer and somebody comes into you for the first training session ever, you're not just going to write up a program with a bunch of weights on it. You're going to walk them through an assessment. Like, here's how you move. You don't have any restrictions here, here, and here. Then we start loading it. Here's kind of the load you can handle. So we'll kind of program our weights based on that. I think a lot of people would be better doing that right from jump with their food intake, is really kind of quantifying it, being like, okay, here's my natural habits. I tend to eat really low protein, really high carbohydrates and fat with a lot of processed foods. And then you're like, okay, well, then what's the next step, right? And then you can kind of work from there.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the hardest things to convince the people I work with to do is just track your food. It's just for some reason people just hate to do it. But almost always it results in a revelation of how off they were from what they thought they were eating. So I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
So you are on Facebook, and where else can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. You can find me at Eats Perform. You can email us. You can pretty much, you can find me anywhere but Twitter, because I refuse to go on Twitter at this point.
Somebody told me I should make an account for this stuff on Twitter, and I was just like, I just can't. I don't know. Maybe one day I'll cave in, but for now I'm not.
Yeah, the cesspool that Twitter has become, just
Yeah.
I can't handle it anymore.
All right. Well, thanks so much for talking with us, man.
Awesome. Perfect, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you guys for listening to my talk with Brad Dieter. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more like this. And if you like the Ronald McDonald House charity that I'll be donating to, please feel free to make your own donation as well.